I sat in my doctor's office last month, listening to the crinkle of the paper on the examination table every time I shifted my weight. My physician is a thorough man, careful with his words, and he had my latest blood work and metabolic panel spread out on his desk. He looked at the papers, then looked at me, took his glasses off, and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He pointed to a specific marker on the page, something called high-sensitivity C-reactive protein, which measures the silent systemic inflammation running through the body. He then pointed to another test we had done to measure the flexibility and health of my blood vessels. He told me that if he covered up my name and my birth year, he would assume he was looking at the internal environment of a man in his late 40s. He asked me, completely seriously, if I had traveled out of the country to one of those expensive clinics that charge tens of thousands of dollars for experimental cellular infusions. I had to laugh. I told him I had not been anywhere near a clinic. I had simply gone into my study, read the actual biology of how our bodies repair themselves, and then walked straight into my own kitchen. The body warns before it collects. Most people realize too late what it was warning them about for years. I am telling you this because I wish someone had told me earlier. Envelopare well begins with what you stop ignoring. For a very long time, I believed a profound lie about what happens to us as we cross into our 60s and 70s. I used to look at the slow healing of a scratch on my hand, or the way my stomach would bother me for days after a heavy meal, or the deep, lingering fatigue in my muscles, and I assumed my body was simply running out of parts. I thought that the deepest repair mechanisms inside me, the fundamental cells that regenerate our tissues, were just dying off one by one, like lights burning out in a very old house. I accepted that this fading was the mandatory price of a long life. I thought my internal well had simply run dry. But when Eleanor went through her serious health crisis a few years ago, that quiet acceptance shattered. I needed to understand what was actually failing inside us. That fear drove me to my notebooks. I started spending hours in my worn leather chair by the window, reading primary medical literature with a pencil in my hand, trying to separate the noise of supplement marketing from the cold, hard reality of human biology. What I found completely dismantled everything I thought I knew about aging. I was reading about our stem cells. I am not a doctor, and my career was in educational publishing, so I had to translate the clinical terminology into concepts I could actually visualize. From what I gathered, we have these remarkable blank slate cells waiting in our tissues. Their entire purpose is to step in, divide, and become brand new tissue when we suffer damage or when our organs just need their routine maintenance. We have them in our gut, in our bone marrow, in our blood vessels. But as I read through the literature, I kept seeing the same grim statistic. As we get older, these cells stop working. They become sluggish. They stop dividing. They fail to repair the damage. And that is why our bodies begin to physically deteriorate. I thought that was the end of the story. But then I traced my pencil over a paper published in 2018 by a highly respected laboratory in Massachusetts. What they documented forced me to stop reading and just stare out the window for a long time. They were looking at the stem cells in the lining of the intestine. Our gut has to completely replace its lining every single week of our lives, which is a massive construction project requiring highly active stem cells. The researchers took older subjects whose intestinal repair cells had become slow and inefficient, and they introduced a very specific metabolic shift. They just had them stop eating for 24 hours. When they looked at the stem cells after that brief period of empty digestion, they found something that the lead researcher described as the most dramatic shift they had ever seen. The regenerative capacity of those aging stem cells did not just improve slightly, it doubled. They were able to extract those older cells and watch them build completely new, healthy tissue at twice the rate they had just a day earlier. The part that absolutely stunned me, the detail I could not get out of my head, was that the age of the subject did not matter. The old cells possessed the exact same capacity to double their regenerative power as the young cells. The machinery was not broken. It was just waiting for the right signal. I needed to understand why. If my cells still had the capacity to repair my body like a much younger man, why was I feeling so old? I kept digging through the journals, and I found another paper, published much more recently in 2024, from a university in New York. This one looked at the stem cells in our bone marrow, the ones responsible for creating our entire immune system and our blood supply. The researchers asked a simple question about why these specific cells fail as we age. What I read changed how I view every meal I eat. They discovered that the stem cells themselves were not necessarily damaged beyond repair. The problem was the environment they were forced to live in. The researchers described the aging bone marrow as being filled with chronic, low-grade inflammation. They called it inflammaging. I visualized it as a slow, smoldering fire inside my bones. My stem cells were trying to do their delicate repair work while standing in the middle of a burning room. The smoke and the heat were degrading their internal machinery. But the researchers did not stop there. They found that when they introduced cycles of fasting and refeeding, it forced those aging blood stem cells to activate a profound internal cleaning process. The cells essentially swept out all the inflammatory damage, digested their own broken parts, and rejuvenated themselves. After that cleaning cycle, those old stem cells behaved almost exactly like stem cells taken from the young. I sat in my study, surrounded by my notes, and I realized a terrible truth. I had spent decades poisoning my own repair crew. I had lived a life of constant snacking, high sugar, and continuous digestion. I was feeding the fire in my bone marrow, and I was entirely preventing my cells from ever entering that cleaning cycle. Some damage happens silently until one day it just does not happen anymore. You do not need fear. You need attention. Before I explain the exact sequence of things I changed to stop this fire and wake up my stem cells, I want to ask you for a very small favor. I regularly read messages from folks who tell me they have watched my videos for months, and they suddenly realize they were never actually subscribed to the channel. Could you take just a moment right now to check if you are subscribed? It does not cost a thing. It takes 2 seconds, and it is the single best way to help this channel reach other people our age who are desperately looking for clear, careful information about their health. When I realized that my cellular repairmen were just suffocating in an inflamed environment, I started searching for the specific signals that tell the body to shift from building fire to building new cells. I found a paper from a laboratory in California that studied what happens to the immune system when we stop eating for longer periods. They discovered that our bodies have a specific growth signal circulating in our blood. When we eat large amounts of food, especially heavy animal proteins, 3 times a day, this signal stays incredibly high. It tells the body that times are abundant, that we do not need to worry about deep repairs, and that our stem cells can just stay in standby mode. But when that signal drops, when we restrict our food intake or change the quality of our proteins, an alarm goes off. The body senses scarcity. It immediately realizes it needs to optimize its resources. So it commands the stem cells to clear out the old, damaged immune cells and generate brand new ones. I had spent my entire adult life making sure my abundance signal was blaring at maximum volume. I never gave my body the silence it needed to repair itself. I knew I needed to change my habits, but I wanted to find direct human evidence. Working with mice in a laboratory is one thing, but I needed to know what works in a human body over the age of 50. That is when I found a clinical trial from 2016 that gave me the exact blueprint I was looking for. The researchers were studying a very specific type of stem cell that lives in our bone marrow, but travels through our bloodstream to repair the inner lining of our blood vessels. They took adults between the ages of 50 and 75 and had them do 30 minutes of moderate aerobic exercise on a treadmill. Before and after the exercise, they drew blood and counted the circulating stem cells. In the healthy adults, that single 30-minute session increased the number of repair cells in their blood by 23%. When I read that, I was thrilled. I thought all I had to do was walk. But as I read the rest of the study, I found an error I had been making for years, a mistake that completely invalidated all the walking I was doing. The researchers noted that in the subjects who had elevated blood sugar, the people with prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, that 23% increase was almost entirely erased. The mechanism was fascinating and terrifying. The physical force of your blood pumping during exercise creates a sheer stress against your blood vessel walls, like water rushing forcefully through a garden hose. That stress signals the release of a gas that tells the bone marrow to release the stem cells. But high levels of sugar in the blood chemically paralyze that exact signaling process. For years, I would take a brisk walk around my neighborhood in Tennessee, feeling quite proud of myself, and then I would come home and eat a large bowl of sweetened oatmeal or a thick piece of toast with sugary jam. I thought I had earned the treat. I did not realize that the sudden spike in my blood sugar was literally neutralizing the stem cells I had just worked so hard to mobilize. I was doing the work and then immediately tearing down the scaffolding. That realization forced me to entirely rebuild how I eat. I could not just exercise. I had to fundamentally change the chemical environment of my blood so my exercise could actually work. I did not do this to lose weight. I did it because I wanted the tissue in my body to regenerate. I started looking for the specific foods that the literature identified as direct signals to our stem cell pathways. My daughter Rebecca, who is a nutritionist, has always told me to eat my vegetables, but I needed to understand the mechanisms before I could commit to the habit. The first change I made involved a specific amino acid. I read a paper from that same Massachusetts laboratory published very recently where they tested all 20 standard amino acids to see if any of them directly influenced the stem cells in the gut. They found that one of them, a sulfur-containing compound called cysteine, produced a massive expansion of the stem cell pool. It worked through a completely different pathway than fasting. It used the immune system to signal the gut to rebuild. I looked up where to find this compound, and it turns out it is abundant in simple foods like eggs and chicken. So I completely threw out my sugary morning cereals. Now my breakfast often consists of eggs. It is a simple, quiet change, but every time I eat them, I know I am providing the exact raw material my intestinal stem cells need to multiply. The second addition to my daily routine was something my father absolutely refused to eat in Ohio: cruciferous vegetables, specifically broccoli. But I had to completely change how I prepared it. I read that broccoli contains a precursor to a powerful compound that reaches into the cell and activates a master switch for reducing inflammation. It literally cools down that smoldering fire in the bone marrow so the stem cells can function. But here is the catch I learned. The enzyme that creates this powerful compound is extremely sensitive to heat. For decades, Eleanor and I would boil broccoli until it was soft and gray. We were completely destroying the chemical reaction that protected our cells. Now, I buy raw broccoli sprouts and put a handful on my lunch. Or if we eat mature broccoli, we steam it very lightly, just until it turns bright green. And we make sure to chew it thoroughly, because the crushing action is what creates the compound. It changed from a side dish into a daily cellular defense mechanism. The third food I incorporated was green tea. And I want to be very specific here because I used to buy those plastic bottles of sweetened green tea at the grocery store, thinking I was doing something healthy. The literature is very clear that the benefit comes from a specific compound in the actual tea leaves that influences how our stem cells read our DNA. It helps keep them from wandering off and turning into the wrong kind of tissue. I learned to buy high-quality loose-leaf tea or matcha. I heat the water until it is steaming, not boiling, to protect the compounds. And most importantly, I completely stopped putting any dairy milk in my tea. I read that the proteins in cow's milk bind directly to the beneficial compounds in the tea and prevent your body from absorbing them. I drink it plain now, usually in the mid-morning, knowing that those bitter compounds are actively preserving the navigation system of my repair cells. The fourth change was directly aimed at putting out that fire of inflammaging. The studies repeatedly pointed to the heavy fats found in cold water fish as the most reliable way to reduce the specific inflammatory molecules that damage the bone marrow. I told Eleanor what I had read, and we adjusted our grocery list. 3 times a week without fail, we have salmon, sardines, or mackerel. I do not fry them, we bake them gently. I know that with every serving I am lowering the temperature of the inflammatory fire inside my body, giving my blood stem cells a safe environment to do their work. The fifth addition to my routine sits in a small jar in my spice cabinet: turmeric. I had always viewed it as just a culinary curiosity, but the medical literature shows that the active compound in it has profound effects on the molecular switchboards that tell stem cells whether to divide or stay quiet. But I learned a critical lesson about absorption. Eating turmeric by itself is almost useless because the body cannot absorb it effectively. I found out that a compound in black pepper increases the absorption of turmeric by an astonishing amount. So now, when we use it in our cooking, or if I mix a small amount into a dressing, I always grind fresh black pepper over it, and I make sure there is a healthy fat like olive oil in the meal. It is a tiny detail, but it is the difference between biological action and expensive waste. Once I had these specific foods in my routine, I knew I had to address the fasting component I had read about. I was cautious. I am 77 years old, and I am not interested in starving myself or practicing extreme diets. My son Daniel, who is an engineer, always reminds me that a system under too much stress will eventually fracture. But I needed to drop that abundance signal I mentioned earlier. I needed my body to switch from running on constant glucose to burning fatty acids, because that is the switch that triggers the deep cellular cleanout. So, I adopted a very reasonable practice of time-restricted eating. 3 or 4 days a week, I simply finish my dinner by 6 or 7 in the evening, and I do not eat anything again until 10 or 11 the next morning. It gives my body a 16-hour window of absolute digestive silence. During those quiet hours, my insulin drops, my growth signals drop, and my cells realize no new fuel is coming. That is when they activate the cleaning crew. They sweep out the damaged proteins, they clear the rusted machinery, and they give the stem cells the clean environment they need to double their efforts. I do not do it every day because I believe the body needs variety, but those few days a week have entirely changed how I feel when I wake up. There was one final piece of the puzzle that I had to confront, and it was the hardest habit to break. I read that our stem cells do their most aggressive repair work while we sleep, but they are exquisitely sensitive to a stress hormone called cortisol. If cortisol is high at night, the bone marrow environment becomes toxic to the repair process. I realized that my habit of staying up late, watching the news, and letting the anxieties of the world agitate me before bed was chemically destroying my own regeneration. I was bathing my stem cells in stress hormones while they were trying to heal me. Eleanor and I made a strict rule. The news goes off an hour before bed. We turned the temperature in our bedroom down to about 65 degrees because I read that a cooler room drastically improves the deep architecture of sleep. We protect those 7 to 8 hours of rest as if our lives depend on them, because at the cellular level, they absolutely do. I want to manage your expectations, just as I had to manage my own. When I started implementing this, the eggs, the raw broccoli sprouts, the green tea, the salmon, the turmeric, the daily walks, the periods of fasting, and the strict sleep hygiene, I did not wake up on day 3 feeling like a teenager. This biology does not work like a pharmaceutical bandage. It is the slow, deliberate rebuilding of your fundamental architecture. For the first 2 weeks, the only thing I noticed was that I was slightly hungry in the mornings. But I trusted the data. I knew what was happening invisibly in my blood vessels every time I walked without sugar in my system. By the end of the first month, I realized the chronic, dull ache in my knees had faded to a whisper. The fire was cooling down. By the end of the second month, the afternoon fog that used to settle over my brain had lifted completely. I had energy that felt clean and sustained, not the jittery energy of caffeine, but the quiet power of an engine running on clean parts. And then came the doctor's appointment. The blood work proved what I was feeling. The inflammatory markers were plummeting. The metabolic indicators were stable and healthy. My doctor was looking for a miracle cure in my file, but the miracle was just the consistent application of basic human biology. I am not suggesting that aging is a myth or that we can stop the clock entirely. I am still a man in my late 70s. I have the lines on my face and the memories in my heart to prove it. But I no longer believe that physical and mental collapse is the mandatory price of those years. When I sit in my study now, looking at the photographs of my 3 grandchildren, I feel a profound sense of agency. I know that my body still possesses an army of microscopic repairmen waiting in the lining of my gut, hiding in the marrow of my bones, circulating in my blood. For decades, I inadvertently drugged them to sleep with constant sugar, suffocated them with inflammation, and ignored the basic signals they needed to work. I refuse to do that anymore. We have the ability to dictate the environment inside our own bodies. We can choose to feed the fire, or we can choose to cool it down and let the rebuilding begin. If you are watching this and you have felt that same heaviness I felt, I hope you understand that your well is not necessarily dry. You might just need to stop throwing dirt into it. You have the power to change the signals you send to your cells, starting with the very next meal you eat and the very next walk you take. Thank you for sitting with me today, and I hope you find the clarity you need to take care of yourself.